Welcome to the DEC4 podcast. You can access episodes, companion articles, research notes and links, as well as information about our contributors and supporters at DEC4podcast.com. Hope you enjoy the program. Hello and thank you for listening. In this episode, we're looking at a particular Elvis show from April 1977 as part of a wider discussion about how Elvis's work around that time was being reviewed and written up in the press. And this is sort of a companion episode to our recent written Q&A with Francesca Lopez, the pioneering webmaster of ElvisConcerts.com, and you can find that interview on our website. So I'm delighted that our leading contributor, Gary Wells, is joining us this episode to take a look at Elvis's concert at the St. Paul Civic Centre in Minnesota on April 30th, 1977. Now, this was subject to a sort of quite devastating review in the St. Paul Pioneer Press by a very well-regarded sports writer named Charlie Holman. But as we'll find out, many of the claims in the article are open to question. It's an interesting chapter in the saga of Elvis and Colonel Parker's relationship, or deliberate lack thereof, with local press while on tour. In fact, Francesca made this point during his interview because of the fact that there was no special access granted, no backstage hospitality. Elvis never gave interviews on the road. Francesca observed that, and quite rightly, that this did tend to alienate reporters in some cities, and this does actually reflect in some of the reviews around this time. So, based on an audience recording of the St. Paul show, I've asked Gary to give us his thoughts on the performance, and then we're going to look in detail at the Pioneer Press review. We're also going to examine some other unwelcome publicity surrounding Elvis and the Colonel at this time and consider whether or not it was actually Colonel Parker's own policy of keeping the press at arm's length that left them open to misrepresentation and misunderstanding, whether accidental or otherwise. And I'm also really pleased that for this episode we're being joined by talented voiceover artist Alistair McMillan, and he's going to read some of the background information and reviews for us. You can find him at alistairmcmillan.co.uk. Okay, so let us set the scene. We are 10 nights into a 13-night tour. An interesting mix of venues from the 6,500 and 7,000 seat arenas in Green Bay, Wisconsin and Saginaw, Michigan, and there were two big nights at Chicago Stadium, sold out at 20,000 each night immediately following our show in St. Paul. And it's interesting to note also that Elvis had played two nights in Chicago Stadium, once again sold out in October of 1976. Our show sold out 17,000, and there are also big shows in Greensboro, North Carolina and Detroit, Michigan. Now, we know that Elvis wasn't feeling great for this St. Paul show, leaving aside his general struggles that have been very well documented, but on this particular night he did have a cold, and in fact he mentions that during the band introduction segment.
Now I'm going to get it. His name is Eddie. The tenor singer, his name is Buck Buckles. I mean, what do you do in front of 10,000 people when your nose start running, you know? Huh? Yeah, that don't look too good. It's really not. Oh, thank you. Excuse me. No. Saying a whore was it? Oh, can I introduce you? Oh yeah, have the little girl with the beautiful high voice. She's from Los Angeles. Her name is Kathy Westmoreland.
So before we get into the detail of the local press reaction and some of the background to that, I asked Gary to have a listen to the show and give us his thoughts. Now, we do have the audience recording embedded on this episode's webpage. As usual, lots of additional information and links. It's not bad quality. It was done from a tape recorder within the audience, and if you use headphones, it makes it quite a reasonable listening experience. And aside from maybe a cut within the band introduction segments, it does appear to be a pretty much complete record of the performance.
Hey gang, it's your old buddy Gary Wells from Vintage Leisure at soulrideblog.com. You either get it or you don't. You are either an Elvis person or you are not. Now, I didn't say Elvis fan for a reason. I hate to say it, but it has always been my experience that the term Elvis fan can often be applied to those who are excessively effusive in their praise and their love of Presley, and often these people will not accept a note of criticism leveled at their boy. And I get that, but I have always used my website, soulrideblog.com, as a place where the media of mid-century can be appreciated and honestly appraised. I have often said that recognizing something's flaws need not reduce your enjoyment of that thing. This principle I have in the past had to apply to my study of the life and career of Elvis Presley. Another way of phrasing that somewhat bloated intro is to say that Presley's staggering Southern charm, his undeniable way with the song, and his immense charisma often will make the assessment of what he did secondary to the fact that he did it and to the way he did it. We are concerned today with Elvis Presley on stage in 1977. Many of you know, of course, that is the year in which Elvis Presley died. And so right from the outset, there is the knowledge that this era will find King far removed from his prime, in the worst health of his life, and indeed only months away from breathing his last. When it comes to judging his stage show, the listener will simply have to use a different yardstick and will, though it sounds harsh, have to lower their expectations considering many and varied circumstances. My good friend George Fairbrother presents on his fine YouTube channel a Presley concert from St. Paul, Minnesota on April 30th, 1977. The King had less than 5 months to live. During these later stages, Presley was suffering ill health and weight gain, as everyone knows, and his condition inevitably had an effect on his abilities as a vocalist. Many other extenuating circumstances in Elvis's life, personal and professional, no doubt took a toll on his skills as a performer. All of this then resulted in concerts that were often nowhere near his best, but during performances, Presley was still able to put a song over and to entertain those in attendance. In the case of the St. Paul show, it is apparent that the end is near and we are indeed facing the final curtain. Elvis does sound game and ready to interact with his musicians and with the audience, thus confirming that he never lost that rapport, nor the desire and the ability to entertain. But he really does not sound in good health, be it from his cold or from other much deeper issues. What I couldn't help but notice was the short length of time he spends actually singing. I guess it really is the Elvis Presley show, and he is a part of that show. In the video on George's channel, we hear Kathy Westmoreland take a solo, and the guys in the band turn their introductions into solos as well. I suppose what I want personally is an adherence to the craft right up until the end, but as we know too well, Presley simply wasn't able to do that. A review of the show in the St. Paul Pioneer Press was as engaging as the show itself, sadly.
Okay, so we'll look at Charlie Hallman's review in the St. Paul Pioneer Press in more detail in just a moment. But it was interesting, Gary noted just how little time Elvis spent singing in the overall context of the show. And this is even more apparent when you consider the show as a whole, which consisted not only of Elvis's segment, but the pre-intermission program, which included the Sweet Inspirations doing a set, the Stamps doing a set, the comedian Jackie Kahane doing his set, then a lengthy intermission, and the constant selling of souvenirs. This didn't always go down well with local press. But there was an interesting comment from a few days later, following the Chicago performances by Martha Groves in the Chicago Daily News, and this is a really interesting observation. She said, Elvis Presley inflicted 2 hours of Las Vegas and intermission pain on his Sunday night audience in the stadium, then spent an hour licking the wounds. I think that is a really fascinating observation. But it's fair to say that Gary and I might just differ slightly as to how we look at this period in Elvis's career. In terms of his performance quality, I tend to be a little more optimistic. By a point of comparison, or to get some additional context, we also have an audience recording of one of 2 performances in Saginaw from this tour. We've linked to that from the website. And it was clear on that particular night that Elvis certainly was feeling better than he was in St. Paul, and it gave a real indication, I think, of what he was still capable of even at this late stage. But let's get back to St. Paul, and here's Alistair to read the review by Charlie Hallman.
Elvis Presley cut short his appearance before 17,000 spectators at the St. Paul Civic Centre on Saturday night because of a bad cold. Ray Crump, equipment manager of the Minnesota Twins and a friend of Presley's, said the entertainer apparently picked up a cold after jogging around Lake Nokomis in Minneapolis on Saturday afternoon. Crump, who spent most of Saturday with Presley, said Elvis has dropped a lot of weight, probably about 40 pounds, in the last 2 months. He has lost most of the weight through jogging and heavy exercise program, Crump said. Elvis dedicated his Saturday night concert to Crump's boss Calvin Griffith and the Minnesota Twins baseball team. It was a nice thing for him to do, said Griffith, after Sunday's 6-5 Twins victory over the Detroit Tigers. Maybe it had something to do with our winning today, Griffith said. The Twins president and many members of his organisation attended Saturday night's concert. That was probably the worst concert Elvis has done in a year, said Crump. Not many of us noticed, but he has been averaging an hour and a half in most of his shows this tour. Several times during Presley's appearance, the singer had to stop for a drink of water, and an assistant, Charlie Hodge, stood by with a box of Kleenex for Presley to use, which he did on at least 2 occasions. Presley even joked about it during the concert. "It's difficult to sing a love ballad with your nose running," Presley told the audience. Presley's early cut-off of the music stunned many of the concert-goers. There was no applause, nor was there an encore at the end of the show. The swivel-hipped rock singer, now 42, has weighed as much as 250 pounds recently. But he is now apparently down near 200. Several times during his concert appearance on Saturday, he had to re-hitch his belt after his loose-hanging trousers appeared to slip down over his hips.
So I wonder, as you heard that review, if maybe 1 or 2 alarm bells might have been ringing. Here's Gary.
Reporter Charlie Hallman had little to say about the performance itself and instead fleshed his review out with anecdotes courtesy one Ray Crump, whose exalted position as the Minnesota Twins equipment manager apparently qualified him to provide a blow-by-blow of Elvis's day and a critique of the concert. Ray Crump reports Elvis caught a cold while jogging out in public. Something that sounds less than reasonable to anybody who knows anything about Presley. Crump also claims to have spent the day with Elvis and was able to report on the King's recent exercise program. The fact that Mr. Crump seems less than reliable is substantiated by his erroneous report that there was no applause at the end of the show and that there was no encore. I mean, something that many will know Presley never did in his life anyways. Basically, from 1956 until 1977, almost the entirety of Elvis Presley's professional life, he existed in a vacuum. As an artist, little of the same analysis leveled on his contemporaries really applied to him. As a non-stop touring juggernaut in the 70s, it was no different. When Elvis came to town, it was a big event for the people. They bought the tickets and went to the show and loved the show and went home happy. And the critiques themselves didn't even matter much. Nobody cared. He was still Elvis Presley. And today, particulars about the shows near the end matter not as well. Sensible Elvis people of today know that Presley's health was deteriorating in the mid-70s, and this took a toll on his personal appearances, his voice, his stamina, and his ability to craft substantial vocal performances. I saw Engelbert Humperdinck in concert when he was 81. The thing that most stuck out was his inability to sustain breath. This, of course, manifested itself in Hump singing in shorter, choppier sentences, and in his inability to maintain notes for very long. Well, what do I expect, I asked myself. The guy is 80. Well, this is the exact same thing I noticed about Elvis Presley on stage in the late 70s, and he was only in his 40s.
So, a little more on Charlie Hallman in just a moment. And I should say, despite some of the inaccuracies in his report, he was a very highly regarded journalist. We don't know what pressures he was under in terms of deadlines, in terms of whether or not he could even get to the show. I mean, I question whether or not he was even there, hence the reliance on Mr. Crump. Gary alluded to the claim of no applause. We can obviously hear that that was not the case as we listen to the audience recording. It's a very responsive crowd. They were having a great time right throughout the concert. The issue of the encore, of course, Elvis never gave an encore. He ended with Can't Help Falling in Love. said his goodbyes to the audience and was in the limousine on the way to the airport or the hotel while the band was still actually playing. Really, jogging around Lake Nokomis. We know that at this point, as Gary alluded to, Elvis travelled even in isolation from his band, and they essentially met up only on stage at this point. His hotel rooms would have aluminium foil on the windows to deflect the sun. He was obsessive about climate control. So, out jogging doesn't really ring true. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Crump, who is a fascinating gentleman, a little bit later. And just one more point on the review. We know not only from bootleg recordings, but also from some other press reviews from this tour and around this tour and this time, that about 1 hour on stage, give or take, was Elvis's normal practice. Gary also made mention of the fact that the commentary around Elvis's performances in the press at the time didn't really matter then or since. And that's very true, because it certainly didn't affect Elvis's box office. But they did form part of a narrative, and in the absence of any other context. Now, it was obviously a pre-internet and pre-social media landscape. Now, of course, we can keep up with our favourite artists on tour. They post videos on their own social media, or what fans have posted on social media or YouTube. We can see what they're up to, and we can sort of bypass mainstream media reporting and actually get straight to the performance without the editorial. But in those days, there was really no other context. So many of these reviews actually got quoted uncritically in other reviews and subsequent biographies. And in fact, Charlie Holman's review of this particular concert actually rated a mention in his obituary in 2015. The full article is on our webpage for this episode, but here's Alistair with an extract.
The Star Tribune's Patrick Royce worked with Holman at the St. Paul newspaper for 18 years and said Holman was a fantastically productive and dedicated newspaperman who was a character without peer. He was the number one character who I've worked with in 47 years of Twin Cities sports writing. But there was more. He could also crank out more copy faster than anyone, Royce said. Holman also moonlighted in the music industry, joining with record store manager Peter Jesperson and producer-engineer Paul Stark in January 1978 to found Twin Tone Records. The label introduced The Suburbs, The Replacements, Soul Asylum, The Jayhawks and others to the public. In 1977, he reviewed an Elvis Presley concert for the Pioneer Press, noting that the King cut short the show before a packed house at the St. Paul Civic Centre because of a bad cold. Presley died 3 months later from something other than the sniffles.
Charlie Holman sadly passed away from cancer in 2015, aged 71. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to Ray Crump, who was the source, it would appear, for most, if not virtually all, of Charlie Holman's review. He was the equipment manager for the Minnesota Twins baseball team, and Charlie Holman, of course, local sports reporter. It's fair to assume that their paths would have previously crossed, and perhaps Ray Crump was a convenient contact for Charlie Holman when trying to get a little bit of background to write for the review. Now, in 2014, the Fox Sports website did a story on Ray Crump in which he described his hobby as meeting entertainers. At that time, he was running a museum of baseball memorabilia and a souvenir shop.
As visitors walk around to the other side of the modest museum, they're instantly bombarded by Crump's personal wall of fame. The wood-panelled wall is filled with row after row after row of smiling Crump alongside some of the biggest celebrities and entertainers of the past 50 years. Jimmy Buffett, Frank Sinatra, Dolly Parton, and, yes, the Beatles. Crump's encounter with the Beatles came about when the Fab Four played their only concert in Minnesota at Metropolitan Stadium in 1965. Instead of hanging out in a hotel surrounded by ravenous fans, the Beatles spent their time before the show in one of the Mets clubhouses. Keeping them company was none other than Crump, who posed for photos with each member as they shot the breeze for nearly 8 hours.
Now, there was a cautionary note from Ray Crump's son in the Fox article as well. He said, "My dad's the kind of guy that you can't discount everything he says, but you also can't believe everything either." But having said that, the claim about the Beatles appears to be true, and that's actually covered in a 2015 article in USA Today, and we'll link to that from our webpage. So, as we've said, there was no press access, no interviews, no real engagement with local media, so perhaps it is a little easier to understand now, without the benefit of hindsight, how Charlie Horman might have considered Ray Crump a sufficiently credible source for perhaps a review that had to be hastily compiled for a pending deadline. By the way, Ray Crump, according to his obituary, passed away peacefully at home on October 18th, 2017, aged 81. Now, there's something that might have actually been preying on Elvis's mind that night in St. Paul. Here's Alistair to explain, and then Gary.
On April 29th, 1977, while Elvis was in Duluth, Minnesota for one night at the 7,700-seat Duluth Arena, he was probably a little surprised to find out that he was, according to one newspaper, up for sale. The Nashville Banner, citing authoritative sources in Nashville, Memphis and Los Angeles, claimed that Colonel Parker had decided to sell Elvis's contract for health and financial reasons. The story claimed that Parker needed a fast $1 million to replace money lost gambling at the Las Vegas Hilton in December 1976, when Elvis was playing what would prove to be his final Hilton residency. Elvis's biographer, Peter Guralnick, points out that the paper's alleged sources were anonymous, and the article contained factual inaccuracies, including the incorrect assertion that Elvis's last Vegas Hilton contract had expired, leading to the reporter's conclusion that Parker would no longer be able to trade Elvis's services to pay off his debts, hence the sale. In reality, Elvis was booked to play his most significant engagements in Vegas since 1969, and the grand opening of the new 5,000-seat Hilton Pavilion showroom scheduled for October 1977. Colonel Parker was in St. Paul, Minnesota, overseeing preparations for the following night's show. He spoke to rival Nashville paper, the Nashville Tennessean, describing the Banner's story as a complete fabrication. "I'm here working with Elvis, I'm in good condition, and I don't have any debts, at least none that I can't pay." Joe Esposito also weighed in, describing the relationship between Elvis and Colonel Parker as cordial, stating that neither had any plans to break their long-standing agreement that had begun with a handshake. The consortium of West Coast businessmen who were alleged buyers never materialized, if they ever existed at all. Having said this, Peter Guralnick concluded, "But it was apparent to anyone who knew anything about the recent history of their tangled relationship that the story was, in essence, true. Too many people had heard the Colonel complaining that Elvis was more trouble than he was worth, that he was intractable and could no longer be effectively managed, and too many people were aware, as Elvis's Los Angeles lawyer Ed Hookstratton was inclined to put it, that Colonel was servicing a problem of his own." Elvis had no doubt about the story in any case. He knew in his bones it was true. And while the consortium of West Coast businessmen who were supposed to be buying his contract never surfaced, driven off presumably by the glare of publicity, Elvis had never felt more betrayed or more alone.
My buddy George also reminds me that there have been reports that Colonel was looking to divest himself of Elvis Presley's contract at one point in the 70s. Much of this episode has been shrouded by the mists of time, but apparently there was a consortium of West Coast businessmen with whom Parker was negotiating, trying to come to terms on the purchase of Presley's contract. Nothing much concrete about this has ever come to light, though it has been noted that Presley at the time believed the rumors to be true. Nothing, of course, came of this, though it had a deleterious effect on Presley's psyche. Also, there was the Presley Center Courts debacle. Joe Esposito and George Nicopolis embarked on a business venture intended to put racquetball courts and spas in neighborhoods across the country. Elvis need only lend his name and reap 25% of the profits. This project went down in flames, leaving Elvis feeling bitter and having been taken advantage of. The contract for sale and Presley Center Courts stories are part and parcel of a sad time in Elvis's life. Things were seemingly out of control. The Presley empire was perhaps getting so gargantuan that it was beginning to crumble under its own weight. The story of Elvis Presley is what it is, not in spite of the tremendous valleys King sometimes found himself in. The story's magnificence, in fact, depends on the dark times. They are almost as much a part of the tale as the triumphs. The mid-70s may be hard to defend, and they may include things that many would say detract from the Presley legend. But I maintain that you cannot have the Presley legend without the fall. You cannot study or appreciate Elvis Presley fully without analyzing the final months of his life, as we have tried to do here. I want to thank George Fairbrother and the DEC4 podcast for allowing me to share some thoughts. For Vintage Leisure at soulrideblog.com, I'm Gary Wells.
And there's more detail on that whole saga of Presley Center courts involving Nicopolis, Joe Esposito, and a Memphis property developer on this episode's webpage. Now, I should point out that during this period, there were many thoughtfully compiled positive reviews. Now, there's a huge press archive at elvisconcerts.com. You can read many of the reviews, good and bad, there. It's easy to find, but we'll put a link from our webpage. So to address a couple of the points that we've been trying to get our heads around this episode, did Colonel Parker's policy of keeping the press at arm's length, the lack of access, hospitality, etc., did that leave them open to misrepresentation and some instances of creative journalism in the absence of any direct first-hand knowledge or information? I think the answer is probably yes. As to whether or not the press coverage from around this period was fair generally, I think we might be looking more at an answer of yes and no. And perhaps we'll leave the final word to the Baltimore Sun from the end of May 77.
Of course, by this time, Elvis is virtually impervious to all criticism. The media have to buy tickets if they want to review him or take his picture. He doesn't need them. The Sun's photographer, who didn't have a ticket, was not allowed in the Civic Centre.
So moving on from the press reaction, I think we also have to consider how those reports have been interpreted in other publications and in subsequent biographies. It seemed to me that there was this emphasis on some of the more negative reviews to, I guess, reinforce this narrative of professional decline. So in part 3 of our series on Aloha from Hawaii, when we were looking at some of the contract issues and some of the other things that were happening after January 1973, I actually put to Gary that I thought that some of these reviews had been selectively used. I'm not sure that he entirely agreed. Certainly some off nights, even up until, there were some great shows, great tight shows, powerful shows right up to the end. How do you see it?
I think that the narrative is basically sound, because when you were talking about the future, the shows that were planned and booked that Elvis never lived to perform, I'm shaking my head thinking, there's no way, I can't envision Elvis Presley having lived one day longer than he did, knowing what we know about the final years and his health. And it fits the narrative to say the concerts were getting erratic. He was not sounding good. I mean, you can hear it from later live recordings. A simple thing like breath control, holding a note, there's incredibly different from even 2 or 3 years earlier. But like you say, he still had dynamism wired into his being. He could still turn it on when he was out there in front of fans. And I think even in Goralnik's book, while we see negative reviews of shows and whatnot, there's still interviews with his band members and whatnot that we've read in other sources as well that say, oh man, there was some nights where we were all in the pocket. He was on fire. He really delivered. So in a way, the guy could perform in his sleep, and I think he often maybe did. And so the highs and lows were related more to just highs and lows. Like you referenced a bunch of other groups and bands. It happens to everybody. Sometimes they're just not on. He had a lot of reasons to not be on night to night, just his health and his life. And I always think of the mental aspect of the round and round. I'm just supporting a lot of people, which would have kept him going as well. I can't just quit and look after my health. People are going to lose their homes.
And just for a bit of additional context in terms of the wider conversation, the book that Gary referred to there was Peter Goralnik's Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, which I had argued in an otherwise excellent and impeccably researched biography perhaps lacked a little balance in the way it applied some of the reviews during this period. So huge thanks to our leading contributor Gary Wells for being part of this episode. You can find him at soulrideblog.com. It's a website that is read and enjoyed by many, many thousands of people around the world. You can also hear him with his regular segment, Words with Wellesley, at the Cocktail Nation podcast. That's cocktailnation.net. And also to Alistair McMillan for lending us his talents for this episode. You can find him at alistairmcmillan.com. Now, in our brief segment after the credits, we look back to a previous episode from Memphis to Vegas, a vintage leisure tour. Gary took us on a very personal tour of Memphis and Las Vegas, and we play a little segment where he takes us on a visit to 1034 Audubon Drive, which was the Presley family's first home in Memphis, and we also visit Sun Records. Thanks to Steve Collins for tech support, to Gainesville for our theme music, and thank you so much for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building. Thank you and good night.
Original music by Gainesville, keeping the spirit of Tom Petty alive in Europe and playing great classic rock and roll. Check them out at gainesville-band.de and link to their socials. The DEC4 podcast is also brought to you in association with tellmewheretogo.com. If you love travel, now more than ever, it's important to listen to the experts.
Podcast terms and conditions can be found at our website, dec4podcast.com. You can contact us there or on our social media. Find us on the major podcasting platforms, and we're also on Substack, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram. This has been George Fairbrother. Thanks for listening.
March of 56, Elvis was flush. It was happening. And like any good boy, he wanted to set up his folks with a home. So 1034 Audubon Drive, you know what? When you travel and visit Memphis and the area and you want to hit all the Elvis spots, it is the furthest thing away from Graceland, and it is only 10 miles from Graceland. It's no time and you're there, but you also, that affords you a chance to see the area. I mean, you're not going to see what it was like in the 50s or 60s, but you're going to get a sense of the city just by driving from one of Elvis's homes to the other. So 1034, I looked it up. They bought it for $40,000 in March of 56. It's in a very, well, I don't want to say plain, it's just in a common, regular type neighborhood, but also depending on where you're traveling from, it's just fascinating to see a street, to see a neighborhood in Memphis, and just to get a sense of what it's like there. It's an interesting little sidebar to your trip. So again, you're trying to reconcile this thing when you're standing out on the road with the pictures you've seen, and it's funny because I feel like I've seen this place before, that feeling you get, and of course you have. And I'm always looking around thinking, are neighbors looking at me and thinking, here's another couple of clowns coming to see this home. And I always think, what is that like? You know, the neighbors of Elvisville, whatever. So there's a small plaque on the brick wall in front of the home that speaks about what it is, its history, but you right off the bat get this sense of this long driveway and the long front lawn. And you remember the stories you've read about once the kids realized he lived there, they would hang out, and Gladys would even entertain them in the house. And it was such a funny, nice, brief point before the guy could no longer live a normal life. But it's an interesting home to see. It's a nice, quaint home, really tall trees, a long front lawn. So they lived there for about a year. And then, like you say, Mike Kerb, a guy I profiled on my website, he purchased the home on eBay, of all places, and he's a music guy, he's a music mogul. I mean, he was running record labels when he was 21 years old, so he's been in the business since the 60s, but good for him, he bought it specifically for use. It's Rhodes College, I believe, that uses it as an adjunct to their programs, and it is supposed to celebrate and to educate kids about the musical history and cultural history of Memphis. So they have events there, but it's a working place. It's a workshop where hopefully the kids will go get a sense of the history of their city and of that city's culture, and hopefully get a sense of Elvis himself and his contributions. And they're working in this home where he lived. And it's even a significant home because it was this first step of, wow, like we've really made it. $40,000 and this home, so it means something. It meant something to the family, and it means something to the fans. So Mike Kerb also hosts a little concert series there. I believe they call them the Audubon Sessions. I have a link in my article on Mike Curb to a performance. I believe it's Roseanne Cash played there, and there's some memorabilia in the room. So it's a functional workspace, and it's also like a bit of a concert venue. So good for Mike Curb. He still runs labels out of Nashville, and he's bought this and provided it to the college, and they use it. And it took us a couple of trips to Memphis to realize, I said to my family, what is wrong with us? Like, it's right there. We need to start, because I think maybe the first time you're visiting, you're tentative and you're worried and I'm going to get lost. Last thing you want to do is get lost in some Southern American city where you're not from the area. So once we, got the maps out and figured out where it was a wonderful addition to our trip. And it's highly recommended mainly because it's right there. It's only 10 miles away, and you get a sense of a Memphis neighborhood. And just seeing that home is a great thing for an Elvis person. Plus, it's impressive, the Mike Curb connection. So that's an interesting destination for sure. You got to go there. Sun is at a kind of a funny spot, and they do have a parking lot there, but it's a little bit narrow and a little bit tough to navigate. And I believe there's street parking there, but we've always parked in the parking lot. But again, you realize there's always a bunch of people around there trying to do the same thing you are. So you're kind of in it together. There's a camaraderie there. Sun is a wonderful experience too, because it is in the original building. The studio is unchanged from 70 years ago. And you realize to yourself, you know what, the pictures, the tiles on the floor, the tiles on the wall, that window into the recording booth, where the control booth, and the awe really is quite something in Sun Studios, because it's a venerable place for Elvis people and even beyond that. And they have a wonderful tour there. There's always a real rockabilly looking guy or girl that provides a really good tour that gives you a lot of good skinny. When you're in the recording space, there's an X on the floor where Elvis stood to record. There's a microphone that they have there that Elvis didn't use to record, and it might not even be from the 50s, but it is a vintage microphone that was used in the past to record at Sun Studio. So people are lining up to have their picture taken with this microphone, which is fun, which I've done, which is a little bit awkward because everybody's kind of looking at you and waiting, and you're even a bit emotional, or you want to cradle the thing, but you can get your picture taken there. And then when they shepherd you upstairs, again, it's fascinating because it is almost like not conducive to a tour, because it is what it is. It's a small building, small stairways, but they take tours every so often, every half hour or whatever, I'm not sure. And it's, of course, a limited number of people because of the size of the place. Upstairs is great. Lots of memorabilia, lots of actual artifacts from back in the day, a recreation of a recording studio there that looks, it is authentic. It contains authentic pieces. They've just sort of constructed it for you to see behind glass. Upstairs is wonderful. Music plays. The guy talks about the history of Sam Phillips and Elvis, but also all of the other artists that are recorded there. It is well worth it. Downstairs, the restaurant. If I'm not mistaken, they've purchased that piece of the block later on, but it is a working restaurant that has a record shop in it, which is fascinating. Wonderful merchandise. I mean, we all need the Sun Records t-shirt or a hoodie or whatever they have there. And it's filled with people milling about, and we all have this common thing. And it's a wonderful thing. And the next door is a more common picture you'll see, the Memphis recording studio with the blinds in the window. And that is your entranceway. Actually, you see Marion Keisker's desk, if I'm saying that properly. And the waiting area, and that's how you get into the recording studio itself. Now that is a highlight, and again, it is 8 miles away, just north of the house, and it is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful experience. Now, if they do it right, which of course is the bonus. I would go there no matter what. They do it right. It's a great tour. It's informative. They play music. The gift shop, definitely, it's the one place maybe that parking and navigating, you have to keep your eyes open and your head up, but it's essential. It's a wonderful trip, and I got to hand it to them. They do it right there at Sun Records. It's a great tour.